Hey everybody, and welcome to another video from the Electronic Armory. In this video we're going to continue our series on architecting a full-stack application using microservices with browser and mobile clients in iOS and Android. This video will show you how to install JHipster, a Java-based application framework using Spring Boot and dozens of other popular frameworks for making the most robust and scalable application out there. We'll also be importing our data model that we created in a previous video in the JDL Studio and showing how JHipster updates our website to handle that new data. We've been using JHipster for all of our backend projects and have been using it for a number of years. It's been easy to set up and gives us extremely powerful tools right out of the box. If you haven't seen the previous videos on architecting your server application and designing your data model, be sure to check out those videos and subscribe to see more videos like this. So let's get started. Here's a great diagram from jhipster.com that illustrates some of the services and architecture that we'll be using in this video. Starting at the top, we have a browser that is making a request to our server on port 8080. In production, this will simply be port 80 like a normal website. That request is going to go to our gateway. Our gateway is going to contain our web application done in AngularJS version 2. You can use React or jQuery or any other front-end framework that you may want. The browser is going to get our Angular code from our front end, and the browser is going to make asynchronous calls to our back end of our application and fetch data to display on that front end using endpoints set up by JHipster. That backend is going to be an instance of a microservice that is going to serve up that data. That microservice is going to be run on port 8081. We'll keep it simple by having one microservice, but you can use the same exact technique to create as many services as you need. If you had multiple microservices, those ports would just increase by 1 to 8082, 8083, and so on. Whether you had one or many services, you need to have a nice way of having all those services discover each other. In our example, we'll be using Consul to be our service discovery and configuration. We're going to run that in a Docker container for ease of deployment. You can also use the built-in JHipster registry, but I prefer Consul. It's really up to you though, and JHipster is very flexible in this matter. JHipster has dozens of other technologies that we'll cover in future videos as we built out our real-life application, so stay tuned for those. Hopefully this isn't too intimidating for you. No worries though, we'll be covering this step by step so even a beginner can get JHipster up and running. If this is your first exposure to microservices, this video is going to be a great introduction to them, and you'll see how powerful they can be. Let's get started installing JHipster. So let's just cover the prerequisites that we're going to need. First, you're going to install Yarn, or if you want, you can use npm. In this example, we're going to use Yarn. And using Yarn, we're going to install Yeoman. And then using Yeoman, we're going to install the JHipster generator. If you're on the Mac, we're going to use brew to install Yarn. If you already have brew or just installed it, you can type in brew install yarn, and that'll install Yarn for you. If you're on Windows, simply go to the Yarn website, download the installer, and install it that way. Once you have Yarn installed, on a console or command line, type in yarn global add yo, and that'll install it across your system. Once you have Yeoman installed, type in yarn global add generator JHipster, and that'll install the JHipster generator for Yeoman. Now, as I mentioned, you can also use npm, and so if you're going to go that route, you can install npm via brew, or they have an installer, or they also have a Windows installer. Once you have npm installed, on a console or command line, type in npm install-g for global, and then yo for Yeoman. Then type in npm install-g generator JHipster to install the JHipster generator. Finally, once that's installed, then you can use yo just like we'll be doing in our example. So the steps we're going to take to install our application is going to be 1. Create a microservice for our backend that'll serve up our data via API endpoints. Next, we're going to create a gateway to serve up your front end. We need to make sure that Consul is running so all of our services can discover each other, and we're going to do this via Docker. Finally, we're going to run the microservice and gateway using Gradle. If you're not familiar with Gradle, no worries, we'll show you how to use it. Okay, let's get started with installing JHipster. Okay, so as I mentioned, you have to have Yarn installed. Once you have Yarn installed, you can install Yeoman. We're going to use Yeoman to install our JHipster application. So hopefully you have all those installed because we're going to get started installing our JHipster application. In our application directory, which I've just called Electronic Armory, we're going to create a directory for our gateway and another directory for our microservice. Our microservice, I'm just going to call Armory. So let's create a directory for that. Next, we're going to create a gateway directory. So once those empty directories have been created, we're going to go into the Armory directory, which is going to be the directory that our backend or our microservice is going to live. So now that we're in that directory, we can use Yeoman to install JHipster. Simply type in yo JHipster. So the first question that JHipster is going to ask you is what type of application that you want to create. Well, this is inside of our microservice backend, so we're going to do microservice application. Next, it's going to ask the base name of my application, and it's going to be Armory. So I can just hit enter here to accept the default, which is in the parentheses in green, or I can type something else new. So I'm just going to hit enter. The next question is going to ask us if we want to install other generators. I'm not interested in that at this time, so let's just hit enter to accept the default, which is no. And the next question is what port we're going to run this on. And as I mentioned, we're going to start this on 8081. Next, it's going to ask what our default Java package name is going to be. Now, this default is com.mycompany.myapp, but we're going to put in our own. So com.electronicarmory.armory. And then it's going to ask what type of authentication what we're going to use with our application. Now I'm going to use JWT authentication, which is JavaScript web tokens. And these tokens are going to not only contain the authentication that we need, but also some package payload information that we can use in talking between our microservices and other such things. Next, which service discovery and configuration solution are we going to use? Now, if you remember, we're going to choose Consul in this particular case. Next, it's going to ask us what type of database that we're going to use. Now, we're going to use SQL because we have some very highly integrated data that we want to have relationships with, so SQL is just fine in our case. And then what type of SQL are we going to use? We're going to use MySQL in this case. And then for development, what development database do you want to use? You can obviously use MySQL if you want, but let's use H2 disk-based persistence as opposed to in-memory, which once you restart your application, that data goes away. We're going to use the disk-based so that data that we enter in between application launches stays persistent. Next, since we're using Hibernate, which we haven't talked about yet, we're going to use Hazelcast, which is going to be our distributed cache for multiple nodes. This is really great for microservices. Again, don't worry if you aren't familiar with these, but choose Hazelcast in this particular case. Next, for our build system for our backend, we can choose between Maven and Gradle. I prefer Gradle just because I'm a little bit more familiar with it with Android Studio. I've used Maven before, and it's fine. It's XML based, whereas Gradle seems a little bit more like JavaScript, though not quite, and I'm just more familiar with it, so let's go ahead and use this. Next, what other technologies do you want to use with JHipster? We're not going to use any in this application, but feel free to add them if these seem interesting to you. Next, would you like to enable internationalization support? And yes, because I like different languages. We're going to have our default language be English, and because I speak a couple other languages, such as German, Hungarian, and Spanish, I'm going to choose those as well, and this will allow us to internationalize or localize our application. Next, since I'm a big fan of testing, I'm going to choose Gatling and Cucumber by hitting space over each one of those and hit enter on those. And that's generated our JHipster application. It's downloaded all the packages, it's installed those files, and created a base Java application for us. Now we're going to do the same exact thing in our gateway, so let's change directory to gateway, and then type in yo JHipster again. So we're running JHipster in our second directory. We run it once for our microservice and then again for our gateway, which is going to generate our AngularJS 2 application. So this particular case, we want to choose microservice gateway, not microservice application like we did in the previous version, microservice gateway. Hit enter on that option, and it's going to ask us what version of AngularJS we want to use. Now, if you want to use something else, you can, of course, rip these out later after the code is generated and use your own, but I'm just going to use what JHipster is going to generate for us. So let's use AngularJS 2. And what is the base name of our application? For this one, I'm just going to type in Armory, keep it consistent. And then would you all like to install other generators? You can check this out on the JHipster website, but again, I'm going to hit no for this one. Which port are we going to run this on? Well, again, if you remember from the previous slide, we're going to install this on port 8080 for development purposes. Once we deploy, which I'll do in a future video, this will be on just port 80, but that's again for deployment to production. The next question is, what is your default Java package name? Well, it remembers what I typed in before, so I'm just going to hit enter to accept the default in green. The next one is, what is the type of authentication we'd like to use? Again, JWT authentication. Consul for console discovery. This sets up the ability to then go out and discover the console discovery and configuration service that we're going to be using. And this will allow us, again, to have all these different services that are run in different folders find each other once they're being run. Type of database, going to use SQL and MySQL for this one, and again H2 for the development database. Hazelcast for distributed cache on the microservices. Gradle for our build system. Now this does matter, even if it's our front-end system, we're going to have our gateway up and running using Gradle. And this is a little bit of a different question from our backend microservice. It's going to ask us if we want to use Elasticache, clustered HTTP sessions using Hazelcast. We're not going to use Hazelcast in this particular case, but I do want to use WebSockets for a future video and talk about that technology. So I'm going to hit spacebar on that and then hit enter. The next question is if we'd like to use libsass as a style sheet preprocessor. I'm a big fan of Sass, so let's go ahead and install that. Even if you're not familiar with it, it's very close to CSS. It'll save you a lot of headaches when developing out your CSS. So let's go ahead and hit Y to say yes to this option, hit enter, and then it's also going to ask us if we'd like to enable internationalization support. Now this internationalization is going to be on our front end, so let's hit enter to accept the default. And again, we'll choose English as our default language, Deutsch, Magyarul, and Espanol. Okay, so let's do that one. And for our testing frameworks on our front end and our gateway, Gatling, Cucumber, and then we have this third option, which is Protractor. Protractor is a really great UI testing framework that we can run really great UI testing, such as pretending that we're a user, typing in a login, putting in a bad login, making sure that that functionality works, logging into the system, and again, making sure that works, and having it act as if it was a user by just giving it commands and what it should do, what it should click on. So I'm really big fan of Protractor. So let's go ahead and enable that, and we'll cover that in a future video. Okay, so now we have our application installed for our gateway. It ran through a couple of different steps, and as you can see on the screen here, it's actually compiled some of our JavaScript. Angular 2 is actually done in TypeScript, so it's actually taken that TypeScript and created our JavaScript application from that, as well as compile our CSS and a bunch of other front-end tasks. Now, we can run our application using the Gradle W, which is a Gradle wrapper command. We can also use our Webpack development server, if you're familiar with that, by typing in yarn start. But now what we need to do is we need to have Consul up and running so that we can discover our gateway front end and our backend microservice. Now to get Consul up and running, we can use Docker to download and run Docker within this. So obviously you'll need Docker installed if you haven't already, but to get this installed, we just type in docker compose-f, and then we go into our source main Docker folder. So we're just going to use this command to download our Docker container and then run Consul right on our system. Again, make sure that you have Docker running, run that command, and once you see this screen that you know that Docker's running our Consul application. Next, we're going to switch to a new tab because currently this application is running in this console. So I'm going to switch to this one, and next what we want to do is run our backend microservice. So I'm going to change directory into our Electronic Armory directory, and then go into the microservice which we've named Armory. Simply run our Gradle command, and we're using the Gradle wrapper, and that's denoted with the W. While that's up and running, I'm going to go into another tab, and in this one, again, I'm going to switch over to our Electronic Armory directory, but I'm going to go into the gateway this time, and I'm going to run the Gradle wrapper again, but this one is going to run our front-end gateway. So hit enter on that command, and this will pull up our gateway application. All right, let's switch back to our Docker Compose, and indeed it is still running Consul, so that's up and running. And we can check out our backend. And great, this is running now. So if you want to hit this locally, we would hit localhost :8081. This is a nice way to test out maybe the endpoints that this is generating, but it doesn't actually have a front end. If you want to hit this externally, well, this is just running on our local box, so it's just going to have a local IP address. Finally, the next important piece, that it is connected to our Consul server. All right, so both Consul and our backend are up and running, so that's great. Let's switch over back to our gateway to see if that's running. And indeed it is. In this case, it is 8080, and this is again our external IP address and on port 8080. So this is all great. And again, our front end, our gateway is connected to Consul. So both our front end and our back end are both connected to Consul so that they can discover each other, and that's great. So let's open up a web browser and let's go to localhost 8500 to look at what the Consul server looks like. So once you have that typed in, we can look at our services that are running. You can see Consul is running and it's passing, and we have Armory, which is great. This is our application, and we have 4 that's passing. We have our front end and our back end servers in here. We can click on these and get a little bit more information about it. But the next thing we want to do is actually hit our application and see what this looks like. So type in localhost :8080, and that'll hit our front end gateway, and then our gateway will go to our back end server and get the information that it needs and pass that information back to the gateway, and we'll receive that information. So congratulations, you just installed JHipster, Pretty easy, huh? I mean, it seemed a little bit overwhelming because we did have a lot of these new technologies that you may or may not have heard about. But if you just follow line by line, we have an application running. And let me show you what this is capable of. So right off the bat, we can see that we have a nice Angular application that has some menus at the top here that are generated for us. We can switch the language to Deutsch, and we can look at what that interface looks like translated. We have Mayor for Magyarul. We can switch it to Espanol. And the interface changes with each option that we select. So this is great. And once we start adding components, we can do our own translation on that. Let's switch this back to English and go up to account. We have the ability to register a new user, and so we can type in a new user and that'll validate whether that username is unique, email address, and it'll send us an email to validate our email, and we have to click a link in order to fully activate that user. So all that's built in, comes right out of the box. We have password, and as I type in the word password, you can see that the password strength for that is poor. So never use password as your password. But if we do type in a 1, it gets a little bit stronger. If we type in a character such as exclamation point, it gets pretty strong. And then maybe another symbol and a capital letter. So it's really checking whether to make sure you have capital letters, numbers, symbols, etc. And then of course you have to type in that same exact thing, which I can't remember. So if I did type in an email address here, email@email.com, and type in a username, it'll allow me to register, but it's saying, oh, the password and its confirmation do not match. So we get form validation right out of the box using Angular Validate. So this is great. Now, JHipster also sets up a regular user for you and an admin user. And if we go back to the home page, you can see what that looks like. So we have login as admin, the password's admin, the username for this one is user, and then the password for that is user. So let's show you what the user looks like first. So by signing in, brings up this little modal. We just type in user and then user. We also have this remember me function, again, right out of the box for free. Now it says that we are logged in as user. Again, this is fully customizable using the Angular application. And then finally, we have a couple of entities which we haven't added yet. Once we add in our data model, these will get populated. We can also change languages if we want. We also have the ability to go into settings and change our username, our first name and last name, our email address, and then our preferred language that we want to have as a default when we log into the system. So again, the localization support is awesome on this one. Let's log out of our user, and it returns us to the home screen. You can see that there's nothing special about this. We customize this based on whether the user's logged in or not. And then also we have roles that we can assign to different users, such as admin or just a regular user, and show them different things. So let's sign in as the admin to show you what we can see is different about that user. Let's sign in here. Now we can see that we're logged in as that admin. And again, entities is blank for right now, but we also have this new menu called administration. Let's go through this one by one. We got our gateway. We don't have anything right now in here. User management, we can see all the users, their roles, a bunch of other information about them. We can delete them, we can edit them right here because we have admin privileges. The next one we have is user tracking. We can actually see as users are on our site what they're actually doing, where they're currently at, etc. Metrics, this is one of my favorite features on JHipster. We have the ability to look at our server and see how it's running. We can see whether we're getting pages not found or maybe 500 server errors, memory, threading, all this great stuff. So I love it. Next is the health. So whether these services are up and running, whether we have plenty of disk space, whether if you want to look at details on that disk space, you can see that we are on our terabyte drive. We have about half of that free, and we have a threshold of about 10 megabytes there. And then we have a bunch of other things that we can look at. And this is really great, and it gives you a really quick view of how your application's doing. So our database on development is using H2, as I mentioned. And if you put it in production, it'll use SQL and a bunch of other information there. So next one we have is configuration. So this will just show you all the different types of configuration settings that we have. Audits is really fun too. You can take a look at that as your system, as different users are going through your application, what's going on there. Logs will be specific. All of our log information, the logging level, etc. API, this is one of my favorites. Again, in addition to the metrics of our application, we have all of our endpoints that we have for our system. Now, this is a really powerful feature. This is using Swagger. Swagger not only goes into our application and investigates and sees what our endpoints are in our Java application, but we can also click on these and test these out. So we can put in some parameters and actually do a password reset right here if we wanted to. Now this feature is also built into the user interface, but when we go ahead and build out our Android and iOS applications, you'll see how we tie into Swagger and how it'll actually generate our API client code for both iOS and Android and any other system you can think of, whether that's a C# .NET application or something else. Really, really powerful stuff. We'll get to that in a future video. Finally, we have our database. We can actually access our database right here. It's going to bring up our H2 login screen. We just hit connect because we don't have a password on this particular one because, again, it's development. And we see our database tables. Now, there's nothing really interesting here right now. We do have some information about our users, the authority. When we add our data model in, you'll see that this gets populated. Okay, so as you saw in a previous video where we created our data model with our entities for our courses and our lessons, we created that in JDL Studio, and then JDL Studio gives us the ability to download a file. Using that file, we're going to import our data model into JHipster, and then we're going to regenerate the front-end files to reflect the data changes that we've made. Now, if that didn't make sense to you, don't worry. Let me just show you how to do that, and then we'll show you what that did on the front end. So to start out, what we need to do is use that JDL Studio file to generate our backend entities, and that'll create the tables in our database. And then we have to do that again on our front end to generate the interface files as well as the JavaScript files to handle that. So let's first go into our backend by going into our Electronic Armory application and then going into Armory, which is our microservice. And then for this one, we're going to use Yo, and then JHipster is still going to be our command that we're going to use, but it has a subcommand called import JDL. And then the next parameter is going to be that file that we've downloaded through the JDL Studio. Now I've just dumped that into my home directory, so I'm going to type in tilde for home / and then JHipster and then tab for autocomplete. Now this will take our data model that we've downloaded from the JDL Studio and import it into our backend. So let's go ahead and see what this looks like by hitting enter. Now, JHipster has created a bunch of files for us, but it ran into our liquid base, which is going to be our database migration tool. Now, it's actually saying that we have to add some code to our master.xml file in that, and if that's okay, well, that's fine by me because this is what I want to do. Okay, great. And it just created a whole ton of files. It's mostly Java files. There's a couple XML files in there as well. And it also generated the tests for those particular classes that we have set up. Again, don't worry if you're a little bit confused on it right now, but let's just go ahead and show you the rest of the steps, and then we'll show you what this actually does. So this is in our backend. We have to switch over to our front end, which is in our gateway folder, and run the same exact command. So I'm going to hit up until I get that command back and just run the same exact file. Again, this is in my home directory, and just hit enter. So it's going to ask us the same exact question, whether we want to change that liquid-based master file. Then we go ahead and hit yes. And the next thing it's going to ask us, you can see that some of the files are different. These are mostly JSON, HTML, and TypeScript files. It's going to ask us if we want to change the entity.module.ts file. And we're going to say yes to this because what we're doing is we're adding entities that we've created in our JDL Studio. So yes, we're going to hit enter by accepting the default, which is the capital Y. The next one is our nav bar. Now, if you remember when I clicked on entities, that navigation dropdown was empty. This is asking us if we want to actually change that file to reflect what we're adding here. So I'm going to hit enter again to accept the default Y. The next conflict is asking us about is our global.json file. This is because we're adding these entities to our localization file. So we've named one of our entities, say courses and lessons and that sort of thing. It's going to add all those strings. These strings are contained in a JSON file. We'll look at these in a future video as we do some customization on our application, but let's go ahead and hit enter to accept the yes. It's going to ask us for the German version. Yes, I want to add those entity entries into our German localization file. Hungarian, yes. Spanish, yes. And it's created the rest of the files. Okay, so it's created these files, but if we refresh our application, nothing's going to change because we don't have live reload on. If you wanted to have live reload, in other words, if you change your CSS or your HTML or your TypeScript/JavaScript files, and you wanted to have that refresh live in your web browser, you can run yarn start to run your Webpack development server, and that'll handle the live reload. So anytime we have code changes, it'll update your web browser. It'll actually refresh it for you, which is really, really cool. For CSS changes, it'll inject that CSS without refreshing the page. Really, really powerful. Suggest you look into it. But to show you another way, we're actually going to do this manually. So what we're going to do is we're going to shut down our gateway temporarily. So let's go back to that tab where that one lives, and we're going to hit Control C to stop this. So now our gateway has stopped. We're going to go back into the previous tab where we generated our new files. And I'm just going to type in yarn. And what that's going to do is that's going to actually recompile our CSS. It's going to recompile our TypeScript into JavaScript and a bunch of other tasks to regenerate our interface. And again, if you want to do that live reload, then go ahead and do this. This is kind of a long way, but I really want to show you what's going on. Perfect. So you can see it recompiled everything. Now let's go back into our previous tab and hit up to rerun our Gradle command to rebuild our front-end gateway and run that. So after we've restarted our front end, we also have to restart our microservice backend. And to do that, we go into the tab that's running this command and we hit Control-C. So I've done that already. And then we just hit up to run the Gradle command once more. All right, now that we've restarted our backend, which is going to apply those new entities to our database and other such files, we can now restart our application. We can go ahead and hit the reload button here, and then we can log in as an admin. And once logged in, we can see that we have our entities set up in our menu. Again, when we ran that JDL file in our gateway, it created this HTML file for this menu. When we ran it in our backend, it created the database files and the classes and the resources in order to give us these entities. Now, we covered these entities in a previous video, but let's go ahead and take a look at these in a little bit more detail. If we go to our lessons, right now there is no lesson in here. We can go ahead and hit create a new lesson, and we'll see that we have a lesson title, description, and language. And of course, we can fill this in as we wish and hit save, and it'll go ahead and create it. But I want to do something a little bit more interesting. I want to go down to the API and use Swagger to generate this lesson for us. So if you click on this and go down to post, because we're going to create a lesson, it'll show you what the example JSON is that we're supposed to post to it. If you scroll down here, this is where you put the values in, and here's an example again. And if I click on this, it'll go and fill that out for me. Now, there's one thing we need to change. We don't explicitly set the ID because the database will do that for us. So let's go ahead and delete that. And the lesson description here, actually, let's go ahead and set the title here. And this one is going to be full stack installing JHipster. And the lesson description is here, is installing JHipster is super easy. Okay, and that's the JSON body that we'd send either from an iOS application, an Android application, or maybe even another web application. So once you have that, go try it out. And you'll see that this gives you the example curl request. It's hitting on port 8080, API lessons, all the information that we passed in here. That's if you wanted to run that on your own command line, for example. And then finally, here's the response that we get back. And it looks like it was successful. So let's go ahead and take a look at our entities under lesson and see what's there. Indeed, this is what we typed in for the title, our description, and the language that we had for that particular lesson that we set up in a previous video. Now notice that this has ID 2. This is just because I tried this once before doing the demonstration, and now we have ID 2. I can go ahead and edit that. We can change this to full stack developer, installing JHipster, and let's take out that exclamation point, and let's change this down to Hungarian and hit save, and you can see that this is all saved here. Now if we go back to our APIs and we click on lesson, we can now go ahead and get those lessons, and we can do paging. We can say go and return maybe only 3 items. We can sort it by the different attributes for each entity. And let's just go ahead and hit try it out and see what returns back. And indeed, we get an array of lessons, and this particular lesson only has 1 in it. And that's how you use JHipster. So there you have it. We've installed JHipster as a microservice, running the gateway on the front end, Consul to do service discovery, and one of our microservices is going to serve up our courses and lessons for this application. Now, if you haven't seen the previous videos, this is part of a larger series on building a real-life application that I'm actually going to use in production. So there'll be a bunch of future videos talking about how to customize the interface, how to customize and restrict some of those entities so that not just any user can create a discipline or a course, just the admin, namely me, so that I can present content in video format and other content so that you can actually take a real-life college course and follow along. And so maybe you want to learn how to be a full stack developer. We'll cover all of that. Maybe you want to be an iOS developer. We'll cover how to tie into the JHipster backend using iOS. If you're an Android developer, we'll do the same thing for Android. So if you haven't subscribed yet, subscribe to this video, The Electronic Armory. Go to electronicarmory.com. Find us on Facebook under facebook.com/Electronic Armory. We're on Instagram and Twitter, and you can find all that information on the website or on the YouTube channel homepage. If you like this video and want to see more, hit that like button. And again, be sure to subscribe for future videos. Thanks, we'll see you next time.